Well, good evening, everyone. This is the second in a series of conversations with artists, which is the brainchild of our former LLM student, Mary Rinebold, who will be conducting the conversation today. Mary was in our 2020 cohort, which was unfortunately the COVID cohort, with most of her sessions conducted online, but she was an excellent student. She joined us not from a law background, but from art writing. And she did bring her own distinct perspectives on art and art law to the program, which was extremely valuable, both to the other students there, but also to us, her lecturers. I'm Miriam Goldby. I'm just doing the welcoming bit of tonight's event. I am actually acting director for the Art, Business and Law LLM program. The usual director is currently on research leave, so I'm filling some very big shoes tonight. And I'm here to introduce the two people who will be involved in this conversation. The first, of course, is Mary. Since graduating, Mary has gone on to work in the legal sector as a writer and as a consultant with Canvas Art Law, a specialist international art and cultural property firm. Mary's parallel creative practice is one of writing, curating, and art bookmaking, having contributed art criticisms to magazines including Art Forum, artforum.com, Flash Art, and Art in America, alongside fiction essays for artists' exhibitions and monographs. Mary's practice has included close work with non-profit organizations and artistic interventions in the US, the UK, and France. And some examples are the Art Writing Library at Goldsmiths, University of London, Proto-Cinema in Paris, and she has also co-founded Kunstverein in New York. So that's Mary, and next I will introduce the artist who you can see on the screen, Haley Mellin. We learned about the incredible work that artist and conservationist Haley Mellin does through our former LLM student, Mary Rinebold. So Mary has very kindly introduced Haley to us. We discovered that Haley's output as artist and conservationist has encompassed multiple interventions within and beyond the art world. In support of locally led large-scale land conservation, Haley founded the non-profit organization and artist-run Art to Acres to support large-scale land conservation, which is dedicated to climate, indigenous peoples, and beta diversity through the permanent conservation of large-scale forests in collaboration with the art community, and supported by artists, galleries, and institutions alongside matching partners. Haley also co-founded Conserve.org, a platform that enables individuals to support permanent conservation acre by acre. Mellin also co-founded the MOCA Environmental Council, Art and Climate Action, Artists Commit, and GCC New York. So an extremely busy person indeed. Haley also initiated the first carbon emissions calculations for museum exhibitions in the United States and Germany, including for the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum, New York, ICA Miami, and the De Young San Francisco. These calculations involve carbon emissions reduction education, community learning, and institutional sustainability improvements. Mellin's support has since shifted to cultural institutions in Europe and the Middle East. As a painter, Haley currently focuses on observational painting in nature. Exhibitions in 2023 include Mickey Meng Parker Gallery, New York, and the Journal Gallery, New York. After undergraduate studies at the University of California at Berkeley, Mellin received a PhD from New York University in Visual Culture and Education and attended the Whitney Museum Independent Study Program. Mellin is the 2023 Max Beckman Distinguished Visiting Artist at the American Academy and New National Gallery in Berlin. So without further ado, I will hand over to Mary.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Thanks so much for being here. We're really, really happy to have Haley with us. Just going to move my chair over a little bit, if you don't mind. That was a great introduction, Miriam. Thank you so much. I'd really love to jump into the conversation, but first wanted to say just a couple of words about how I met Haley and a few things that I really love about her practice. Haley and I met years ago in New York, and I was always very taken by Haley's talent and determination as an artist, but also as a community builder, as well as her warmth and generosity. I've had the honor and pleasure of working with Haley through exhibitions and through collaborations. And I first knew Haley as a painter. And in my professional and personal experience with Haley's painting practice, she's skilled and has an almost encyclopedic knowledge of the history of painting, which I think is really interesting. I've also experienced Haley's incredible ability to gather people together and to really build communities. And I think that this is an expression of an enormous amount of generosity as an artist. I think that Haley somehow manages to be both a painter in a sometimes necessarily really individualistic practice, and at the same time, take all that talent and skill and apply it to making connections in a really generous way and seeing what happens when various people meet and what they can do together. And she does this in a way that I've always found extraordinary. And I think that this work in building communities and understanding how other artists work, by my observation, has laid the groundwork for Haley's incredible practice in art and activism in the sphere of global climate action, which is partially what we're here to talk about. As Miriam said, for the second in our Artist Talk series here at Queen Mary and CCLS, I'm honored to be able to bring Haley here to talk about her work, not only as a painter, but also her incredible talents in community building and how that has really led to what she's doing in the climate action sphere. And I think that there's a lot that art students can learn from this, that art law students can learn from this, and that lawyers and other practitioners who intervene between both the legal sector and the art sector can learn from this. There will be a conversation, and then at the end, there will be questions. Questions can come here from the audience and also online. So please feel free to type those in if you're tuning in online. Haley, we'd love to have had Haley in person, but we're really lucky that she can be here tuning in from the US. So without further ado, let's get started. Hi, Haley.
Hi, Mary. Hi, everyone. Thank you for that introduction, Miriam. That was quite a summary, and it's just a total treat to be here with you today. This is the first time I've ever gotten to speak to Queen Mary and to the Center for Commercial Law Studies. So it's an honor, and it's an honor to be one of your 2023 visiting artist lectures. Where would you like to begin today?
I'd love to begin. We just have 2 more people coming in, so I'll let them, hello, come in. Just to let me, oh yeah.
I was just going to say, for those attending who have known Mary for a while, we first met as younger people in New York living and working. I think I was in school at the time, and we got to work on a number of curatorial and writing related, teaching related projects. So it's great to be able to reconnect with you, Mary. I hold you in very high esteem.
Haley, I feel the same way. Thank you. And I think there's something here for students too, that the connections that you make right now, you're going to be amazed by how long they last and how often you think of these people that you're meeting now and how much they affect your life, because it's just so great to be able to continue to work with Haley. Just one note, just to let everybody know, I'm looking here because this is where Haley is for me. So feel free to look here, but that's why I'm looking at a black square. Haley, I'd love to start, if we can, by talking about your painting practice, because as I discussed, this is how I first met you. I recall the painterly process being a big part of your work. When I was sitting down really thinking about your paintings, I remember noticing that there was a real painterly quality, and by that I mean I could really see the brush strokes, I could really see the detail work in your work. And that was always something that I really liked. I've noticed that recently, just looking at your show at the Journal Gallery and other shows that I've been finding, it looks like you've been working plein air, depicting subjects from the natural world. I also recall in years past that you were working with portrait subjects that, from my interpretation, seem to be from photographs. I would love, if we can, for you to take our audience a little bit through your story as a painter and how you got started painting and as a student and on.
Yeah, of course. I think for me, painting is somewhat of like a litmus test. It sort of gives me a sense as to where I am in my development and understanding. But I started as a young person. I think my mom gave me like a box of watercolors when I was quite young. And I started taking figure drawing classes at night through high school. And I think I had my first show when I was like 15 or 16 in the backyard at the local cafe. I was quite committed to the very like paint nature of paint when I was quite younger. Like I would make my own paints. I was very like hands-on in that way. And so I would say I was definitely like a painter. I practiced, you know, charcoal drawing and watercolor and oil paint. And quite like liked that there was this strange activity we were doing, which was like moving color around on a sort of flattened piece of wood, i.e. paper, or on a piece of cloth. And there was just something like exceptionally basic about that, or like historic about that attracted me. This sort of magical space that conveys something we convey to one another, but doesn't maybe move into the non-human realm in terms of interpretation. So I was quite interested, and I spent most of my like teen years like reading books about now deceased artists and reading their biographies. So I have painted a number of different subjects over time, but most notably, I began as an observational painter, like sitting there looking at something, recording it. And then I moved more into a conceptual phase during like school and grad school, and then since then have returned to observation.
Thanks a lot, Haley. Something that I really love about that is that I think is extraordinary about artists is that just from the beginning, you knew that that's what you were going to do, and you were able to put up a show wherever there was space to do so. And I think I actually see a little bit of a reverberation of that in your work now, that painting natural subjects, you're taking advantage of whatever surroundings there are and ensuring that you're able to work with that. And I think that that's really interesting. If we could, I understand that you have engaged with a practice called digital realism. And I also understand that some of your influences in the past have included Gerhard Richter. And I think that Richter's engagement with systems, Richter, for those who, Miriam's nodding her head, but for those who might not be as familiar with Gerhard Richter, is a German painter and who works in series. So we'll do I may be wrong in this, please correct me, Haley, if I am, but what seems like hundreds of paintings of one subject, like family photographs, or the famous Sonic Youth album cover with a candle, or various landscapes. There's obviously, that's the depiction of a subject, but there's a real system happening there. And I actually see a similarity between the way that you work with themes, Haley, but I'd love to hear, and for the audience to hear a little bit more about digital realism and your engagement with that term and its relationship to systems.
Yeah, of course. So when I was going through school, this thing that the artist Josh Smith had said, like, what do people paint? Like, what is subject matter? And I thought that was interesting. And I didn't really know where my subject matter was at the time, which seems funny now, but there's this, how could you say, curiosity that is consistently pressed during grad school of sort of thinking and maybe overthinking your practice. And at the time I was writing on the digital aura, like what happens to the effect of painting as it's compressed into a digital space. And so I really wouldn't put many paintings online because I didn't feel like there was a clear one-to-one transversal. Like the image would be something online and it would be something in person, but never were those two things the same. And they could be quite good in both worlds, but they would operate separately. So I was interested in making paintings. And so I really wanted them to be seen in person. And I was doing a series of talks and sort of conducting my dissertation research at the Museum of Modern Art at night for a couple of years. And in those conversations, it helped me come closer to my own, I would say, trust in my intuition, which was I really felt painting should exist as painting as much as possible. And so I had an affinity for Richter because of his technical and somewhat metric-based process in his career. Like, he did all his gray paintings, and then he just would go from subject matter to subject matter. And I think his curiosity was both boundless, but I also think it had absolutely sometimes nothing to do with the painting, but more the practice of painting and showing up each day. And if you look back historically, into other cultures, not necessarily into Western art, the practice aspect is actually quite the important component, right? That you're doing it, that you're carrying out what we would call ritual. So Richter's ritual was rather like 9 to 5, so to speak. And he was working with a few things, but one of them was the life of painting under the presence of photography. So like, what happens to painting with photography present? And so my interest was really what happens to painting with the digital space, because I was born, sort of at the early gesticulations of the internet. So I was born pre-internet, and then you come into an internet space. And so this question of how do you paint, or do you paint in what way in a digital era, was of interest to me. So I was doing both paintings that were hyper fine, like with lots of little layers of glazes. Like, imagine like 15 glazes, which is essentially a glaze is medium, or like a clear substance that can harden with a little bit of pigment. So it almost becomes like a stained glass layer. And I would stack like many, many, many layers and let them dry. And so in the end, the painting would be what I would call digital real. Like, it almost looked like it was printed. And so when you photographed it, it would go back into a digital image, right? So you really only could see the feeling of the painting in person. And then I was also printing on oil paint. So those two things were like things I was playing with during grad school.
That's really interesting. I actually never understood how layered that was. And I can really see when you use the word ritual, I can really see a relationship there between finding systems. And
I think since this talk's happening in the UK, one thing to note is, like, if you look at Turner's paintings, like if you go to the Tate Modern and you take a nice walk and you spend time with those paintings, like, those are almost entirely glazed paintings. And it would take sometimes 2 years for those paintings to dry. So we don't have a lot of glaze in paintings anymore because we want them to be done very quickly, right? So you can sort of see that change in our philosophical or our cultural engagement towards speed by the rarity of glazing in contemporary paintings, because they take a long time to dry.
That's super interesting. I actually see a relationship between your work and Turner. And everyone here, please take Haley's advice and check out the Turner sections. And I know that Turner is someone who's been talked about in the ABL course. And I think that That's super interesting. If I could stay with, I think, the painterly process for a moment. I understand also, Haley, that you have worked with conservation of paintings and would love to hear a little bit more about that practice, if we can.
Yeah, of course. When I first moved to New York, I wasn't certain I was going to move to New York, but it was either like go become a regenerative farmer somewhere in the center of the country or move to New York. And so I ended up taking the train from where I grew up in the Bay Area, north of San Francisco to New York City, which is a very long train. And I really wanted to be near painting that I respected, and spend time with that. So I would do sort of strange things to try to make that possible. And like once I applied to be the executive assistant to like the CEO of Sotheby's, and I was like in the 11th hour of those interviews, and I realized I just wanted to be like next to the paintings, and I was, I don't know, 24, 25. And so one way I've gotten to spend time with old paintings is through painting conservation, and it's somewhat of a private hobby, but I've done it for about 20 years, and it's really an exceptional act because you can come to really respect other conservators, but also if it's done right, it's like you were never there. So there's like no trace of your presence. So it's actually very calming for me, and I try to do it at the end of the day, and I try to work with works that are, you know, between 50 and 250 years old. And there's just also something really nice to know that the painting is going to continue to be seen where it wouldn't otherwise because it's been conserved. So you do become aware of this notion of stewardship that you know, myself as an artist, I can't speak for other artists. I work for a time when I'm no longer here. I like this notion of longness or longevity, and painting conservation holds hands with this notion that we are trying to steward these like stories and narratives and beliefs into the future.
That's very poetic. I really like that. I think if we could there are two words that stuck out for me that will shift us to the next part of the talk, and that's conservation, but also stewardship. And if we could shift to another expression of your work, and particularly your work in community building, and a thread, I think, with your work in stewardship towards stewardship of the climate and of natural places, and conservation in terms of climate conservation. And this is a really important part of your work, Haley, and a part of your work that I have, that you and I have connected on, especially recently, and that I think is really important for art law students to learn about, and also for art law practitioners to understand. And so we're going to tease that out a little bit. And the first question that I would like to ask you around your work with climate conservation, not painting conservation, is I'd love to know how you work with the art community around conservation and getting a handle on carbon emissions, which I think the work that you've done has literally brought about a sea change in our field. I really cannot emphasize that enough. I know a little bit about the change that your activism has inspired in the cultural community, but for the sake of our audience, I'd really love for them to hear a little bit about the background of your activism and the communities that you work with.
Yeah, of course. I think as a young person, one of my first words was like leaf, except I think I pronounced it neef. And I've always been very interested in trees. I'm also somewhat of an introvert, and so I like being outdoors by myself. But I just find that there's a lot of mystery in the natural world, and that there's a lot of beauty. Like there's things that I can't create as an artist. So I've been drawn to this notion of stewardship and this notion of protection. When I was a younger person, I just knew I wanted to engage large-scale land conservation with the cultural community, because the cultural community is the space that I am living as a human. And I think, work with where you are, like start at home, work with your neighbors and the people next to you. I also feel intrinsically connected to other artists, and I really enjoy their company. And in terms of land conservation, I grew up in a place where there was a lot of land, like there was a lot of open space. And I liked I remember being like 8 years old and volunteering because my dad had us volunteer a lot. Just like in a normal community, we just go out and do something on the Saturday. And I just thought it was amazing that there was the forethought that people would leave land natural in some places. So I did about 15 years worth of research, and I decided to learn from other humans. I didn't go to school in the field on purpose. And I was teaching at night and working. So it was just sort of a slow procession. And then in 2017, I thought I'd just start with 1 acre. I don't know what this is, and maybe I'll only ever do 1 acre, but I'll do 1 acre. And I found that land conservation, or large scale land conservation, which means community led or locally led conserved areas. That could be an indigenous conserved area. Sometimes it's a national park. That's pretty rare, but sometimes. It's very similar to making art. It's a very slow process, and you're thinking about longevity. You're thinking about what is the legacy of this action. You're thinking about artifact, actual physical items. And so in 2017, I founded Art into Acres, and the purpose of the nonprofit was to support artists and other institutions, collectors in large-scale land conservation. But I definitely felt pretty alone. The cool thing about tree is that it's some of our oldest technology, and it's our most scalable technology to take carbon emissions out of the atmosphere. So it's constantly pulling atmospheric carbon out of the sky, and it's sequestering it in its body or in its root structure. It's called stored carbon. So trees are great. Large scale land conservation is great for the climate, but also there's a very high level interest on my end for biodiversity. And in that space, in being rather alone, I worked on starting a lot of different initiatives and co-founding initiatives, which are now, all thriving, and they're their own entities. And there's a great young community in the climate and art space, which we can all say was a sector that was actually rather behind other sort of fields in moving into sustainability and climate responsibility.
I think that that really cannot be emphasized enough. There's been a lot of action recently, but it's definitely been more recent. That's really interesting, Haley. I think what we would love to know here is how you engage the law with your work in conservation, land conservation, that is.
Yeah, I think on that last point, I just want to also note that we all are making either a solution or a problem together. And I think there's something exceptionally creative about finding a new approach to doing a lot of our habitual actions so that they are decarbonized and so that they are climate aware. And so as someone who has taught for a long time and went to school and education, it's pretty awesome to see people learn and have these aha moments. So I think that the way we've done it and sort of co-founded a bunch of initiatives that exist now has just been very humble and just sort of getting on Zooms and getting together. And to your point, Mary, I guess it just really amazes me how this is a person-to-person enterprise. To me, working with law in the conservation space and in the art space, it comes down to working with another person and finding avenues that feel right and that feel true and feel just, but also just feel like the roads we can functionally take. So in terms of land conservation, conservation is kind of a strange word because it's actually a very Western word. So I don't know if there's probably better words to use. You could use the word stewardship. You could use the word caretaking. We have a long human history of taking care with things. And that's very much a human activity, and possibly different animal species have also this tradition, but probably don't know that yet. So in land conservation, a lot of the work is legal. It's sort of using pre-existing laws or supporting the creation of new laws that, in a very often elegant, frankly, and very thoughtful way, work to support local communities and heritage tenders of those landscapes, if anyone lives on them or lives around them, in protecting the natural world around which they live or in which they live. And sometimes the laws have been written and have never been used. So there was a case recently in Ecuador where there was a water law, which essentially was a watershed protection. So imagine this incredibly sophisticated piece of language, right? Because law is formed in language, in words, being transposed and conserving or supporting the permanent protection of around 100,000, let's call it hectares, 100,000 hectares or 250,000 acres of this Ecuadorian watershed. And so in that case, we were engaging and exercising a law that had been made quite a bit earlier and had never been used. And also in terms of the law, when most of the conservation that I've engaged in has been funded by the sale of artworks. So an artist will donate a piece of work and it will go to conserve a location. And because of the incredible price differential between those two things, one work that's 50 or 60 square feet can often support the conservation of hundreds of thousands of acres. So what I like about that is that when you engage art law and also title law, they actually end up being quite similar. So titling and sort of ownership, or this notion of titling or tenure of a holder of an artwork, can sometimes be very similar to toward that in land.
I think that is actually extremely relevant for us, and gets at a lot of the notions that I remember us talking about on the course and that I've talked about in practice. And I really like the connecting of the notion of title between ownership of a movable chattel and ownership of land, and the way that relationship between art and the conservation of land can be really literal. There's so much that I get to thinking about. I feel like that's another dissertation that could be super interesting. I think something that we are interested in is your work and how you're working with land conservation. I think that there are some also practical ways that students here who, if they're looking to work in the law, would be interested to know are ways that you could see art lawyers supporting conservation and sustainability. Are there holes that you see? Are there ways that students who are looking to practice in this area might better be able to support the type of work that you do?
Yeah. Well, just to go back to the last point, and maybe I'll correct myself. I think the legal aspect is more like land tenure. So most of the locations we work on supporting conservation are not privately owned. They're owned by communities or large indigenous groups. And so a lot of times they actually don't have the rights to their own land. So I think that's the interesting thing, is actually titling. But into how people can engage, I think one of the things I find to be really interesting is starting with oneself and one's own history. And so in a way, we know we need to act, right? The current statistics say we need to decrease our carbon emissions by 50% decade on decade, and we're still going up this decade. But I found that unless you act in a way that's wholly personal, it doesn't tend to function as well. So from the positive side, some positive side, there are a lot of initiatives within the arts sector that the art community would really love the art law community to embrace and to help develop. There's, from a carbon calculation perspective, there's the Gallery Climate Coalition, which is based in the UK, as you know, founded in the UK. The calculator is actually a great resource. And so you can sort of shift up, how do I make a carbon budget? This is the amount of carbon emissions I want to engage. Or how do I decide what I was naturally going to do and reduce that by 50% in line with the Paris Accord? That's a brilliant, very simple act. Like recently I was traveling and I did take the train, right? It would have been an 1.5-hour flight. It was a 9-hour train ride, but that was in line with my decision to how I was going to travel that week. And actually it was an exceptionally productive train ride. So I think there are tools out there. There's also the strong desire for the support of services. So one of the things that can be very helpful is to just do what you already do, but offer it toward the climate space. So you already have these skills and most people don't, especially art law. It's a very rare ability. So if you can possibly donate or volunteer your services, like I was working with the magazine Art Form, and they called and they said, hey, we would like to be more sustainable. And part of my practice as an artist was just to take those calls. And so I was committed to supporting each institution or nonprofit in their first sustainability initiatives for a couple of years during COVID. And we found in looking at their product, like they were still going to print and they were going to still ship in plastic. And that was part of the printer's requirements. So instead, like a really ingenious idea came up, which is they just donate space now. They donate printed or online ad space to climate related or sustainability related initiatives in the arts. So I think like be where you are and figure out how to engage or support. From another level, the art community has created something called strategic climate funds. So instead of doing a carbon offset, which is a retail product, and a lot of that money goes to the retail maker, like maybe $3 goes to nature, $20 goes to the market maker. And also it's not very transparent. You don't really know where the money goes. Instead, make donations to related nonprofits in the climate space that are actually pulling emissions out of the atmosphere or protecting more emissions from going up. So those are some ways, but I think really just start with what's personal to you. And we don't want to just focus on specifically climate. We want to engage climate, but there's also other concerns. Like we've lost, I think 70% of our animal populations in the last 50 years. So there's other ways you can connect.
That's really interesting. I think that because we are here in London, and Haley, you mentioned the GCC, which is the Gallery Climate Coalition, which is, I think that this was the first one that was founded, if I'm correct, was here in London of GCC. I'd love to shift over to talking a little bit about your work in system building and nonprofits in the US and the UK, which you talked about. And maybe we can start with talking a little bit about the work that you've done with the GCC internationally. And I think it's really relevant for our audience today because, as Haley mentioned, that is a resource that's here right now, that's there for businesses and businesses who you might go work with, institutions, individual artists. I've even used the calculator on a personal basis for my family. I think it's really, really helpful. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about that for our London group.
Yeah, so GCC is going short for Gallery Climate Coalition, but they support artists, they support museums, and the aim is to create an environmentally responsible art world. You can sign up and become a member. That is free to do. And the goal is really to focus on the global community, to sort of everyone sort of comes together and signs up and puts pressure and puts like accountability to shippers like Crozier or to insurers to support a more equitable and just climate reality. So you have like an interest in sort of aiming for shippers to allow for more things to travel by sea freight. Like, for example, there's a Gary Hume show at Matthew Marks in 2019. They traveled it by sea freight, reduced the carbon emissions by 96% of that exhibition, not including visitorship. in terms of, I know, so cool, in terms of like shipping all of the waste from all the crates. So putting pressures on shippers to have reusable crate materials and to promote that more. So anyway, just by signing up, you're like really helping as an individual. So please do that. And that's easy to do from the website. It was created by a range of individuals, like I think about 10 in the art community, and since has made nodes. So we supported them in making a GCCLA branch, and more recently I supported them in making them a GCC New York branch. And I was in Berlin, as noted, for the residency at the American Academy last month, and supported the sort of constituting celebration gathering for the first GCC nonprofit, which is in Berlin. So I think it's just really fun to come together with friends and do things. I was really amazed by that community, and I've really liked working with them. We just did a first ever booth at Basel Art Fair called Art for the Future, where fellow artists, Rosemary Truckle, Josh Klein, Nicole Wittenberg, Julian Cruzet, who's representing France in the next Venice Biennial, and Marina Saramayo came together and donated works for conservation and for climate. So I think GCC is local. They're great to work with. And if you can go into any of their talks or even come on for pro bono loss, like legal services, that would be major.
Thanks a lot. I think I just want to second what Haley said, that the website is really interactive and really straightforward to use. And I just really encourage all the students here and any legal professionals just to have a look. And I think that what you're talking about in terms of bringing communities together and how fun it is to work together, Haley, it's just something I've always seen that you've done and that I've always really liked. And right from the start, that it seemed like you just loved the process of seeing people meet and see what might happen from that, and seeing how we can support each other and what communities can create. And I think what you talked about doing at Basel, I mean, as you said, that's the first time that there's been a booth like that. That's incredible. And that an artist like Julian Cruzet is like super busy right now, took the time to do that, because this is really important. And this is part of the genius of your work. I really think that you're able to get people together and realize that, especially around climate, that this is really important and that it's not something that we can just, opt out of. And I think that
we can't, there's no opting out, that's for sure. But I mean, that was all like Victoria Siddell, who used to direct Freeze. She called it like in May, and she's like, oh, we have this booth, like, should we do this? And it's like, that'd be great. But the whole GCC team was wonderful. Aoife and Heath and Poppy on that project. It was also great that Basel donated the booth. So we couldn't have done it without that. I don't know. I actually, frankly, I'm rather an introvert, but I find, if you're not going to be around a lot of trees, being around a lot of people is also pretty great. And I think we all secretly like people, even though we don't always say that. And I think teaching for a long time has also taught me how to like listen better and like talk into people's listening a bit more. And that feels good when you can actually connect, because connecting is a great feeling. We all agree that connecting is a great feeling.
Yeah, I agree. I think that one of your past interviews that stuck out for me, in one of these interviews you mentioned that, and please correct me if I have the wording wrong, but that museums and conservation are actually similarly interesting structures. And I'd love to hear you speak about this similarity a bit more. And I think it would be very helpful for our audience, because there are lawyers here and there are students here who work with museums quite a bit. I didn't realize how much the law engages with museums. And I think that if we can hear a little bit about the similarity of museums and conservation from you, Haley, it might help some of us to understand how we can better help in conservation.
Yeah, I think, well, those are two separate questions. I think I'm gonna start with the second one. I think, we have different like durational time spectrums. And from a technical perspective, we tend to exist in entropy. in contemporary life, like things are changing quite a lot, right? And where you live and who you date and what you do. And like, there's always just this sort of like combustible turnover. But there's very few things that last, right? Like if you still have your drawing from when you were 4, like that's very precious to you because it's something that like stood the test of time and lasted. And so, you know, museums support our ability or our decision, I guess, our collective decision to move these objects through time into the future. And there's not that many things that exist through time. Like we have like 1% of our historic like writings, like most things disappear. But if you think about it, writings, some like buildings or like artifact objects, art, children, and then conserved areas or areas that are like protected, and then maybe inventions, like there's sort of those things we steward into time. And so this notion of longevity is quite interesting to me. So when you're working with museums, you're really working with these sort of cultural spaces where we can look into and see things and connect with things made by people who are no longer here. And so there's like that really, there's a third principle, right? So like someone makes something and they die, and then there's the thing that they made, and then there's the person coming along and looking at it. And so there's this like triad connection where the thing is sort of connecting you to that person from a long time ago, whether that be a writing, a scripture, an art, a painting. So this notion of durational time is quite interesting, and that connects both in conservation and in museums. Both things are about artifact. Of course, a conserved area is like, or an old growth landscape, let's call it that, is all time compounded. So you're looking at essentially what it looks like from the beginning of time till now. And a painting is a moment in time, right? But it's a complete moment in time. You're not going to go back to 1982 and make more of those works. So I think that the nature of artifact is very interesting. And I think preservation as a concept is not as like embraced these days. But I think if we can embrace preservation, it's going to be good for us, at least start to understand what it means. And I think the term sustainability is rather laughable, because why would we want to create something that's like not going to be sustained? Like we don't want life to sort of die out. Like life is amazing. So yeah, those are my thoughts.
That's really interesting. There's a word that a French artist once told me, and I don't know what it is in English, which is odd because it's not like I think in French, but it's called a caro, and it's like when you pull up from snow in the Arctic and you can see every layer of snow from now back however long, you can see layers of snow. So you might be looking at, I don't know if it goes back to prehistoric snow. But when you were talking about being able to see layers of time in old growth forest, I really thought of that notion of like the caro, that you can pull something up from the earth, or like tree rings maybe, or and I haven't actually ever connected that to artifacts in the museum. It's super interesting, that notion.
Yeah. You had a question earlier that actually I'd like to return to you if possible. How do you think that art lawyers can support climate sustainability and conservation?
That's a really good question. And it's, I think, one of the reasons that I'm really excited that we're all here tonight. I think, Haley, you answered one of, or you already responded with one of the key practical pieces that I would give to people, which is head to the GCC website, use the carbon calculator. If I were to think about what art law students might be able to do, aside from that practical approach, it would be something that's a bit more in research. And that would be to start looking at artists like Haley, who engage with both art and also with global climate action. One of the reasons that Haley and I reconnected a few years ago is because for my LLM dissertation, I wrote about art and ecology, and Haley was one of the first people that I interviewed, and it was really a pleasure. And the more that I researched, the more I realized that, you know, within the past 50 or 60 years, there are other artists, you know, the big ones being Gustav Metzger, Joseph Beuys, Agnes Dane, who have engaged with ecology, or with, in Gustav Metzger's case, you know, the climate emergency. But then there are also other artists who I hadn't thought of, like here in the UK, you can head down to Dungeness, and Derek Jarman's cottage has now been preserved and saved, which is really cool. And that was a note on climate because it's right near a nuclear facility. And I think that, you know, getting to know artists like Haley and researching what they do and understanding where these types of artists are coming from and what's important to them, because I think that when we start to understand each other and have empathy, then we learn how to support each other. And Haley listed some really awesome ways that I think the legal and the art law community can support. And I just see that being able to really grow when there's an increased understanding of this type of work and these type of artists. And I think that that would be one of my key inspirations for someone, would be to really, really look into it, because there's so much interesting work. I forgot to mention Robert Smithson. He worked a lot with land, and there's a really rich history of this. And then there are artists like Haley right now. Precious Okayoman, who works with plant life, I think is doing super interesting things. There's so many artists out there who are working in this area, and I think who would love to be able to talk to a lawyer when they need help, or just to have a conversation, have a coffee, connect with a lawyer who might understand this type of work a little bit. And I think that would be really helpful.
Yeah, I feel like that's very well said. It's a, you know, it's an interesting space because it's one we all like share, right? Like we have our different disciplines or fields or whatnot, as they call it, but like the natural world is something that we all live in, we all share, and it's necessary for us to find our own approach to it. I'm going to screen share really briefly, Mary, and then we can wrap. Let me see if this is possible. Here we go. Is that on?
I see Haley.
So this is,
Yeah, I see
what do you
Haley
see?
shared screen sharing, but I don't see content yet.
Well, maybe it won't work. Okay, I'll drop it.
Miriam's suggesting that you could send it to who?
No, it's fine. We can drop it.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's fine. Where would you like to go from here?
I think with the time that we have left, if we could take some questions from the audience and also any that may have come online, that would be great. Great. I'm going to pass the mic to you. We have a question, Haley. It's on right now.
Thanks so much, Haley. That was really nice to hear about your practice, and actually so much to think about, especially in terms of sort of the word stewardship kept coming back into my mind as you were speaking. My question for you is about archival practices and whether you think that this is something that could also be tied into stewardship as well. And the reason why I mention that is my name's Rima, and I'm from an organization called DAX, which is protects copyright in artistic works. And DAX, about almost 10 years ago, set up something called the Art 360 Foundation, which looks at archival practices. And I think what has been quite interesting from archival practices is when it's really artist-led, that there is an opportunity for stewardship and preservation that can be applied in wider context. So I just wondered if you had any kind of thoughts on how archival practice connect to the work that you're doing or what you were talking about today.
Yeah, sorry, just one, how would you define archival practices right now in this context?
So probably from 2 points of view. So one would be the artists themselves looking at their repertoire and archiving, labeling, sustaining their kind of their entire repertoire of work, but then the other being like legacy. So where an artist has died, for example, and someone else is doing that on their behalf and looking through their work and kind of identifying what would be considered the more important aspects of their work and what isn't.
It's so fascinating. It was funny because one of the things, can you see me okay here?
Yes.
Because I can't see you. Okay. One of the things I wanted to show you visually was about that. It's so fascinating to think of, what do we mean to archive something? And since we started with Richter, we could just talk about Richter's archive, which is really sort of more than a repository, right? It's like largely an artwork. I think Benjamin Buchla argues it is one of his greatest artworks, where he's archiving, right? So just the act of collecting and stewarding or preserving or taking care of these images. We had a series of conversations at the Neue National Gallery in Berlin, and one of them was attended by a range of contemporary artists like Simon Denny and Katerina Grossa and Tino Segal. And Tino noted that on one of his recent performances, he had tried to get the climate control of the museum turned off, right? Because climate control in institutions, energy in institutions, is essentially their largest annual line item in the budget, but it's also exceptionally challenging from an emissions aspect. Like when we did the Museum of Contemporary Art Los Angeles calculation, I think 64% of that annual carbon budget came from cooling the museum. So as an artist, I was like, wow, that's significant. And so we were talking about, like, how do you ease this notion of climate control in a space, like literally climate control, but how do you also stay in line with archival interests? And so one thing is, like, of course, you can just like shift it a few Celsius degrees, like, right, you can sort of slightly widen it, but what does it mean to preserve things? And what would it mean, like, in a society to have things that look exactly like they did hundreds of years ago? They haven't changed at all, while the world itself has changed, right? Or maybe inside a space, it's always, the archival practice is that it's always exactly like 72 degrees Fahrenheit, but then the world outside is going through these upheavals and climate refugee, exceptional tragedies, and what is the environmental justice of that? So one of the things that has unfolded is this like incredible, frankly, I think it's fascinating, interest in archival practices and the philosophy, right? And so an artist who works quite a lot with ecology came and visited recently, Jessica Siegel, and we were talking about the film she makes and how, like, where is the energy that powers that film? Right? Is it, what kind of energy? Is it renewable energy? Is it coal? But in a way, she's causing that energy to be drawn in. And she's like showing this ecological film, but what is her responsibility to that larger process? So, I mean, some of the earliest paintings I ever studied were the Fayum portraits in the British Museum and the Petrie Museum, the Ashmolean, and those are paintings that were sort of conserved, right? They were like burned. They're our oldest human portraits, but they were not archived well. And so I think conservation practices have changed. And I would argue that artists should be more involved with their conservation decorums or mandates. Like there should be a document when you make the work that stipulates how it should or should not be cared for. So like maybe it's okay if the work decomposes in 50 years. Like how does Anneke Yee, who's an artist who works with very tangible and very sort of shiftable materials, like, is it supposed to just sort of stay like that forever, or can it naturally decay? So I feel like there's not a right or a wrong answer, and it's not for me to say, but it would be very interesting if artists didn't sort of let go the moment the work is sort of signed and done, but instead had quite a bit more archival literature. And some artists do, but not the majority. I'm a big fan of keeping things. I think that's very interesting because we don't know in the future what's going to be of significance. And many careers have taught us that. So keeping things, I keep everything. I'm such a nerd, but like I still have my stamp collection from when I was like 7. But this notion of what does it mean to have an archival practice, or what does it mean to conserve something, and what is our goal? Like I specifically do like that very old paintings look like they're very old, right? So I think that these are all being turned over into questions. And, you know, more recently, Katerina Grossa had an idea. She's like, why don't we have summer exhibitions and winter exhibitions, like artworks that can stand different kinds of temperatures? So I think that the archival practice right now is a very curious one, and it's a fascinating space to be in. And if you want to engage more with that thinking, I would look at the Key Culture website. It's like KI and then culture. And they are doing some of the more like complex communications regarding institutions and preservation. And Tino Segal and Caitlin, who's the founder of Key Culture, the artist in that nonprofit founder, have come together and made a climatological sort of, well, for lack of a better word, like tree, like something you sign and you start to like look at your relationship to preservation.
Thank you. Thanks, Haley. Do we have more questions here? Do we have any questions online?
And I don't want to keep everyone over because I know you have your dinners.
Yeah, and you have your lunch probably. Anyone else? Okay. Just to wrap up, but also to come to Haley's point about archiving and about how artists conserve their work. I want to second what Haley said, both from the perspective of having worked with artists from the art perspective, and then having worked with artists from the legal perspective. There's a lot that lawyers can actually do in that area. It can be worked into contracts when there's commissions. You know, what is the conservation manual? You know, what are the artist's thoughts if this happens? How is, if there needs to be conservation, how's that going to happen? Who's going to get the artist or someone from their studio there? Or if it's posthumous, what is the plan? And these are things that lawyers can be really helpful with, and that the law can be really helpful with. So I just wanted to get that.
Mary, if you wouldn't mind making my email address available, if anyone has any further thoughts, or if anyone would like to donate legal services, that would be amazing, and very welcomed. Whether it's legal services with actual artworks or advising, a lot of our space could be expanded if we actually had advice in this direction. Me specifically with artwork title and donations, but I think also just the wider community.
That would be amazing. So let's make sure that we find a way to do that with the people who are here, that we can share Haley's information. And so we have come up to our time. If there's no more questions or comments from anyone, Haley, I'd like to say thank you so much for being with us today. And I always appreciate a conversation with you. But okay, so we can see that Haley's email address is here. So, and I'll make sure in person that anyone can get that who's here tonight as well. But Haley, I always really appreciate a conversation with you. And I feel like today we achieved something that I really wanted, which was for everybody that's here to really have that amazing interaction that I feel that I have when I'm with you. And I feel that everyone here got to feel like they were in on that conversation and a part of that conversation. And so I really appreciate it, Haley, and thank you.
It's a pleasure, Mary. And I really like that you're spearheading this series of talks. I hope you do one again in the fall. Sorry that I'm not in person. Definitely have the next one be in person, but you know, this is the way we are at. The ecological space one day will be replete with lots of local speakers. But in the meantime, it's just a really good treat for me to get to talk to art law students. And it's such a, from an artist perspective, it's a very mysterious space. I'd be so curious to learn what you're learning. And we appreciate you being with the art community, as we know, is the art world is unregulated. We appreciate you like being like knitting together some of the fabric. I have yet to work with anyone in art law from the GCC space. So again, if you guys would like to come forward, that would be really cool. And I sort of give a big warm hello to Queen Mary as a college that you guys are doing this sort of work and you're doing this sort of education. So way to go across the board. Thank you for the time today. I hope you go out and, you know, make the changes you want to see happen. And I'm looking forward to communicating in the future. And thank you, Mary. Thank you, Miriam, for hosting. Mary, for doing all the work over the weekend on this as well. So looking forward.
It's been a pleasure, and it always is. Thank you so much, Haley.
Have a good night, everyone. Bye.